Two of South Africa's most troubled state-owned entities are now without CEO. Just this past week, Transnet Group Chief Executive Portia Derby tendered her resignation. Of course, it comes in the midst of reports around difficulties with appointing an Eskom CEO. Allegations of interference also seem to be marring that process. We're joined by independent analyst Khaya Sithole and political analyst Dr. Ongama Mtimka. Good evening to both of you. Thank you for your time tonight. Khaya, I want to kick off with you and just really start with the state of these SOEs, in particular Transnet, because, you know, there have been complaints around what is happening with Transnet for close on a year now, at least, that we've seen a deterioration in the operations of that particular entity. The fact that we've come to this and we now have the resignation of the CEO, does it mean that is this the step that's needed to get Transnet back on track?
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers. I think the problems at Transnet have been building up for quite an extended period of time. But what we do know is that in recent times, there's actually been an acceleration of some of their biggest challenges that they have. And I think what we then also saw is that there was this extraordinary push by the various constituencies ranging from the minerals councils and other business chambers, which simply said that, look, left to its own devices, Transnet was simply not going to be turned around. And of course, they said that they had tried to sort of reason and sort of engage with the executives on a more intimate basis, but when that failed, they then issued what were really public calls for the removal of those particular executives. And I think also it didn't help that the financial fundamentals of Transnet in particular have really been deteriorating to such an extent that it was very difficult to figure out what was it that Transnet was tackling as an immediate, fix, where they simply trying to deal with the financial situation, or were they trying to fix some of the key operational challenges. And I think, unfortunately, the view that has now obviously been taken by the shareholder and the board is that perhaps a new executive team should be the one that tries to sort of initiate or at least continue what is the turnaround that we know is underway, but it's just not happening at the right pace.
Khaya, do you believe that as far as accountability goes, that there has been enough accountability on the part of the executives at Transnet, but also on the part of the shareholder and its role in holding those executives accountable, and in particular, the role that Minister Pravin Gordhan plays here?
I think in relation to executive accountability, obviously what the board would have is a particular set of indicators, performance indicators that the CEO and her executive team would have been expected to meet on an ongoing basis. I think from what everyone has seen, or at least what is information that is publicly available to the public, clearly most of those particular performance indicators have not been met. And I think those particular issues that have then made that the board had to deliberate on the question of whether they thought that this executive team could ever meet those particular performance indicators, and if so, what type of support was needed to get them there. And I think the fact that they've obviously tendered their resignations is as close as you get to accountability for having failed to live up to that particular expectation. When it comes to the question of the shareholder, the biggest problem that we have in the country is obviously the question of what the shareholder can do versus what the board should do versus what the executive should do. And I think in relation to the state-owned enterprises, it has become very clear that we don't have the right model, because when you hear about why there are governance challenges at Transnet or at Eskom, the question of the involvement and the role of the shareholder always comes not in the most complimentary manner, but also as an issue that itself creates new challenges in relation to defining who's accountable for what. And I think obviously Minister Pravin Gordhan has presided over these strategic entities where we clearly have seen a particular problem in relation to the governance and the executive leadership, where he either hasn't got the right mix of the board and executive structure that is needed in order to turn them around, or maybe there are other issues, but clearly I don't think he's ever going to claim that he's performed well in relation to his oversight of these two entities in recent years.
We continue our conversation looking at the state of the country's key SOEs, including Eskom and Transnet, both now currently without CEOs. Independent analyst Khaya Sithole, part of that conversation, so is political analyst Dr. Ongama Mtimka. Dr. Mtimka, let me come to you and then explore this question of politics here. We've seen a lot of politics at play, especially at least publicly on the part of Eskom, not so much with Transnet, but it's certainly sort of the underlying message that one always gets a sense of is that not everything is as meets the eye when it comes to how these entities are supposed to be functioning. As Khaya mentioned, the role of the shareholder versus what that looks like in reality.
Sure. So good evening to you and your viewers, Kathy, and to Khaya, who engaged the discussions about the business of the enterprise quite well there. So indeed, the state-owned entities operate by design within a political business network nexus. That's quite interesting. They've got the very nature of being owned by the state, with government being the shareholder, means that the extent to which, there can be accountability that is enforced by shareholder activism comes in two ways. One, in good faith, sometimes if the representative minister, the minister representing the shareholder, has got the best interests of the country, and we have seen that is in processes of appointing boards of directors as well as chief executives. But also, sometimes it can be in bad faith, where you find that the attempt is not to ensure that the business succeeds, but it is part of a framework of institutions that are captured to advance particular interests. Which one we have at a particular time is a very interesting one. We generally do not get to judge the intentions on the basis of knowledge that is leaked by those involved in the direct processes of managing these companies or providing oversight over them. But sometimes it is seen in the extent of interference and what the object of that interference seems to be. In this instance, we know that the general principle was to build after state capture. How much of that has taken place is obviously, or it was explained by Khaya, and also the financial reports of Transnet itself, where you see that it's battling to get back the revenues that it used to get up until about, I think, before 2021, if I'm not mistaken, and also providing solutions to the expected range of services provided to the stakeholders that are affected by their business. This has been a key issue that has affected Transnet, and in fact energized stakeholders to put pressure on the resignation of the senior leadership. It will be good if we can get a sense from colleagues in the media and those that are directly involved as to what is at play, broader than what is claimed to be, the reasons for where we are at the moment, the extent of political interference, if there is, and how good or bad that is. Accountability, though, Kathy, to go back to your question, I think you posed it to Khaya. I don't think that we are getting accountability in the full scale of it, because remember, the senior executives are not acting alone or failing alone. If they fail with their boards and some people within the entities and the political principle. So if we are talking accountability, we shouldn't see it in part, but holistically, wherever there's evidence that there hasn't been, somebody has leapt on the job, as it were.
Khaya, before Parliament this year, it was placed that over 300 billion has been spent on SOEs since, over the last decade, and, almost half of that going to Eskom. That's money that, if we look at in the context of what has gone to corruption at these SOEs within that same time frame, could have gone very far in just the provision of basic services, or even just ensuring that these entities are not costing the economy what they actually are. So what is it really going to take now to turn things around for the better? Because you and I, and other ordinary South Africans are suffering as a result of the state of these entities. We're paying the price for that.
Yes, so the amount that you refer to relates to the bailouts that have obviously been advanced to these entities. And I think it's always important to highlight that bailouts are a matter of exception. There shouldn't be any entity that depends or relies on bailouts. Bailouts should be advanced in instances where perhaps the business model of the entity has particular flaws and limitations, and we know that the Eskom business definitely has particular limitations, and then the state must then say, as a once-off gesture, we are assisting you in order for you guys to be able to stabilize your entity until you obviously get things right. And I think the fact that these have now become a much more common and a much more frequent occurrence indicates that internally we haven't got the right business models for managing these entities to make sure that they remain viable and sustainable. And the problem with that, of course, is that, again, because bailouts are an exception, they always end up being redirected from elsewhere, where if the state had had its own ways, we would have said, look, you as an entity must run your affairs in a manner that is viable and sustainable so that we can use what little funds or resources we have available to run other social measures. And of course, when we then see the redirection of those funds, it comes at a cost. It comes at a trade-off somewhere else. And sometimes it's not always easy to be able to pick up where the trade-off is, but we do know that there isn't a decision that doesn't come with any consequences. So whether we're ever going to turn them around is simply a matter of if the state is actually going through a process of trying to understand what would it take to make these entities viable on a standalone basis. And if that is up to be understood, then how do you get the right people to be able to get it there? And I think the fact that we see so many of them having these executive shuffles means that that sense of stability that you want to be able to see is something that remains elusive for a lot of the strategic entities, and that is a national tragedy that we all have to pay the cost for on an ongoing basis.
Dr. Mtimka, what is the risk that we as South Africans are bearing currently with the situation being what it is, the interests at these SOEs, at least to the extent that we've been made to understand where some of these interests lie in the big contracts, what goes to who gets a share of what? What is the risk for us as we stay in this situation?
Well, there are multiple aspects of the risks that we face. First of all, these entities play a crucial role in the logistics network of South Africa, being monopolies in many of the utility sectors. So the immediate risk is that when they do not perform, they affect the economy negatively. Also, the mounting of their debt is a problem for the state because we do not have an abundance of financial resources as a country. So the more money that gets spent in them and the less the returns come in terms of the good services being ranged, the less is available for other service delivery or other public sector commitments in terms of the fiscus. And I think also, Kathy, in agreeing with what Khaya is saying around the business model for these entities, we do not have a way to have a lot more accountability for public sector or state performance in South Africa. And I think that this is something that is increasingly going to cost us big time. We are seeing a change in voter behavior where voters have become a lot more aware of what we would call regime performance. And regime performance is going to also cascade to state-owned enterprises and the entire public sector. That kind of voter, in my view, is going to force the political economic system, if you like, to be a lot more sensitive to performing, because there is knowledge in the system that voters have become a lot more aware of and a lot more sensitive to failures of performance in the public system, and that is going to ensure that we have a lot more accountability and therefore performance.
All right. Well, it's certainly going to be interesting to see how that then plays out within this current election cycle, Dr. Mtimka. Khaya, I'll close it off with you then. Ultimately, when it comes to these entities, we need to see some kind of change. That that will necessarily happen has not been proven. But it's cost the economy. How long do you think it's going to take to make sure that we don't continue to feel those losses to the extent that we're seeing right now? I'm just thinking about the jobs that have been lost as a result of goods not being able to move on rail with Transnet.
The problem that we have is that even though there is a view that everybody understands the sense of urgency associated with fixing these organizations, that doesn't seem to be matched by the efforts or the actions that we see at government level in particular. I think if you look at the time that has elapsed since Andre de Ruyter left Eskom and the fact that there was still nowhere closer to finding a replacement CEO, it doesn't inspire much confidence in the government's understanding of the need or the urgency of this particular crisis. And if that is going to be the template that we follow in relation to Transnet, it means that we are going to spend many more months without a permanent CEO, even at Transnet. And the problem with those is that obviously when people are acting and people do not have the substantive appointment letters, their capacity or at least their ability to then essentially implement a strategy with a long-term view is very limited by the fact that you do not want to start putting together a strategy that you know you're not going to be accountable for implementing. So it does create a sense of paralysis because we do not know whether a new CEO might come with a different vision or a different view. And of course, for as long as I'm acting and I'm not the permanent person, I do not really regard it as my responsibility to start crafting a long-term strategy of an entity. So that's the type of paralysis that gets associated with not having permanent leaders in place at these particularly critical organizations. And we're hoping that the government, in particular the president, can impress upon the minister the sense of urgency associated with getting these entities right so that we do not hear stories of many more months of back and forth between the boards and the minister on who should be appointed and how they should be appointed. The country quite simply cannot afford that cost any longer.
It really does feel like a state of paralysis, Khaya. Thanks for your insights tonight, Khaya Sithole and political analyst Dr. Ongama Mtimka.